Welcome everybody, we're Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Jose.
I'm Mike.
And today we have Matt Denny with us.
Dr. Matt Denny.
Dr. Matt Denny, who actually is currently the co-editor of a wonderful issue of
Film Philosophy.
Film Philosophy on Surfaces, which I've been finding really impressive and interesting. But today we have him here to talk about
Hereditary.
Yes.
Hereditary, as you prefer.
Well, you know, you say it, but they don't have to potato.
It's because you and I were together undergrads at the same time here.
Yeah.
And I remember you being very interested in kind of hammer horror and sort of folk, occult horror, British kind of stuff, which I was talking about in the previous podcast on Hereditary. And I sort of suggested that you and I, Jose, were kind of not enormously qualified to really consider Hereditary in those terms.
Yes, we wanted an expert's view.
And I think we came to the right guy.
Yes. So part of the reason why we wanted to talk to you is because there were things in the film that we thought were patterned, that kind of some extra layer of meaning or some depth or some metaphor was kind of implied by it, and that actually we just couldn't figure it out. We couldn't tie up the pieces, and we wondered whether you might.
Yeah. So what did you make of Hereditary?
I think it's something you said in your podcast discussion, actually, that it's definitely an interesting film.
Yeah.
But how much I actually enjoyed it and found it a pleasurable example of the genre, I'm not sure I could say that much. I think there's a lot of it that, if we're talking about this whole period of horror now being like this art horror kind of thing, it seems to be very much trying to do that at the expense of being an enjoyable horror film, for me anyway. But that could just be personal taste.
So what films would you put under this art category of horror? What would be recent examples?
It seems to be this label that's used, kind of art horror, post-horror, elevated horror, to describe any horror film that's critically acclaimed in order to distance it from bad, normal horror. So Get Out's been described in that way, A Ghost Story, The Witch a bit earlier, It Follows, I think, has been roped in to that category, and then it goes back to more classical examples like, or older examples like Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist or The Shining is kind of the big one. And I think you can really feel The Shining in Hereditary.
Right. Okay. How interesting. So in a way, the sense of art horror or elevated horror is really a way of putting the genre down, right? It's better than a horror film. It's elevated.
It's like it can only praise horror at the expense of horror, which I think is part of the thing that's so telling for me about Hereditary, is that it's so much of it is not what you think of as conventionally a horror film, compared to something like the Conjuring films, which are very cleverly and interestingly generic, but aren't being spoken about as post-horror or art horror because they are horror films. They're kind of unequivocally horror films.
Yes.
So in the actual the text of the film, how would you make that distinction between a kind of more generic film like The Conjuring and what Hereditary is up to?
It's a really interesting question. I think it's because, and again, I think it's going back to something that you mentioned, in that the family drama elements don't necessarily speak to or are worked through convincingly through the horror.
Right.
And like the fact that it becomes a horror film is perhaps part of the issue there, that it only eventually turns into...
It feels like a kind of separate concern, doesn't it? It feels like the intention of the film is to set up something reasonably normal, although it's heightened and it's weird. A girl gets her head cut off by a lamppost. It's nonetheless it's sort of grounded. It's like you say, it's a family drama and a tragedy, and then the wilder supernatural horror elements jump in and kind of take over. I think it feels to me deliberate rather than something that was accidental.
I mean, that's right. So, and part, because there is a patterning of things, right? You expect a payoff, and I kind of thought, well, maybe I'm just not clever enough, or I'm not familiar enough with the genre, to detect what the payoff is. So, for example, there seems to be some connection between the Toni Collette character making that installation, which is a house, and then becomes a metaphor for the home, which then the home is a place for something else. And I just could never kind of cue in as to, what was happening each time. So, the camera often goes into the dollhouse, right? Or the installation house in quotation marks. But what is the connection? Why? When are you cued in? There seems to be something there that I just didn't catch.
I also felt, I'm sure there were shots, like establishing shots of the house and its surrounds in the kind of woods that used tilt shift effect photography to make it seem like it was a miniature. You know what I mean? It's like so again, it kind of drawing a link there between the two. But again, what it's saying, I suppose you could it's sort of saying this is like a toy house where these people are playthings for something much greater.
Yes.
Which I guess ultimately is what the film says when the demon comes back and they've just been used to bring this thing back.
Yes, I mean, yes. Okay. And it's interesting because obviously it is thought through on some level because that's one of the posters for the film. Right? So, this it's a playhouse for otherworldly beings, I suppose. But is that all there? Is that it? Because actually, it seems that it's overdetermined. Then all of those shots of going into the house and the connections really aren't quite made as clear. Yeah, I mean, so on a metaphoric level, yes, but is that?
I mean, that's certainly how I was trying to process it and understanding that idea that by having that similarity between the installations of the dollhouse like quality of those, and then the idea that it being a supernatural occult horror film is positing the idea that there is some external force that is controlling or has power over the actions of the individuals within the film, and perhaps even the Toni Collette character, the mother, as the agent of that in some ways, because I think there are odd moments like the sense of how aware she is of what's happening, how much she is just a plaything or how much she is an architect or a tool, perhaps rather than
couldn't figure that
a
out,
plaything.
The film seems to be ambivalent on that as well, right? So she says, I've been distancing myself from my mother my whole life, and you get a sense that actually that is tied to a feeling of not wanting to be an agent for those things, right? So, but then how she becomes one, like the process or the development didn't seem cohesive to me.
Yeah, and I think it's toying with a couple of things that horror films are interested in, and one is the kind of going right back to something like The Innocents or any kind of gaslighting type of horror where you're unsure if it's madness or the supernatural, but it seems it's really on the nose with just having this kind of litany of mental illness in her family, and then the way that, and I think Collette modulates it quite well with her performance, the way that actually a rather believable reaction to the supernatural is to go mad. Like, that's a really Lovecraftian kind of response. Like, that is completely destroying your sense of how you thought the world works. So her reaction in that first seance scene where she essentially just has a panic attack, I think is one of the most interesting things I've seen in a horror film for a while. This idea that it's not just, oh, that's a bit shocking, or this is interesting and playful, like stacking chairs in Poltergeist. It's, that shouldn't happen. I've looked under the table, this isn't a trick, I'm sure that this is real, but it shouldn't be real.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. That's a really good point, actually. That kind of struck me too, although I hadn't really thought about it. Like, I think it's partly that as the world sort of generally becomes increasingly skeptical of things, and people are always like, oh, I love science and stuff, which is a bit overblown, but there is an increasing understanding of kind of how to think about things skeptically, and I think like that looking under the table is something that you might not have seen in the 1970s, but it's something that is the first port of call now, and I don't think it necessarily speaks to the character as much as it speaks really to the audience. The audience wants to know that there's no trick here, and you're kind of sort of establishing for them that no, this is actually supernatural, this is really real, and something's happening. And then, as you say, she takes it kind of so to heart that this is something completely unbelievable that again, that felt kind of novel to me as well. And that speaks to, I think, what I found really realistic about the film, the way that people kind of react to those things, and so that's not part of the family drama, which I was kind of talking up before, but nonetheless, it's Colette's character sort of responding through a really believable kind of this is okay. I'm getting out of here. I like that because it's so light as well. It's not like she didn't have to see the husband being set on fire to have that reaction. She only had to see something move on the table.
Yeah.
You know, it's really light, and I like that. Yeah.
And I think the son's reaction after the accident can be interestingly read in that way, as it becomes a weight. It's an unthinkable horror that he's become involved in, and that's even before it gets properly supernatural. That's like the instigating, the inciting incident, and then his reaction is to just go, I'm going to pretend this didn't, or not even I'm going to pretend this didn't happen, but I can't process this, so I'm just going to act mechanically.
My brother sent me, let me just find it. He sent me a text this morning saying, how did you ignore that? and it was a really good point. He said, where is it? That moment after the beheading is so good, and unfortunately precedes the most frustrating narrative drop in memory. But how do you just skip over the boy having killed his sister when the shot holds on his face straight after? Which is a really good thing to pick up on, because that was, again, it was that... And I suppose I talked about it just very obliquely in the first podcast when I said, like, how do you talk to your family about that, the horror of what you've just done? But it was that kind of processing it himself and essentially being unable to process it himself. Yeah. Like, this isn't a film in which people can just take things as they occur and then respond to them. People just shut down when it happens.
We spoke about the aftermath of that at length. Yeah, the blaming of the mother and the son, and yes, which all has to do with this idea of of processing that. But I mean, for me, kind of part of the problem, part of what doesn't make sense about the film, is this idea of complexity, and also what I see as slightly different genres. Yeah. So within horror, for example, you think things like the gaslighting films or the supernatural films, are all quite different than, let's say, I don't know, the monster films or they kind of, and actually this one brings in quite different elements. So for example, at the very beginning of the film, I thought, the focus on the daughter and what she represented, I thought there would be something creepy and supernatural and that then becomes kind of more body horror, on the one hand, there's the contrast between the child being, even through, that wonderful face that the actress has, kind of, something from another world. And then, all the conversations that the Toni Collette character says, I wanted to abort you, right? It almost feels like they belong in slightly different films. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to think through the Charlie character a bit, because as you said, on the one hand, there's very much the sense of this is a creepy child film. It's The Omen or something like that. And then actually thinking that it is kind of The Omen, but The Omen getting frustrated, or because they're trying to bring about the rebirth of the Paimon, one of the kings of hell demon creatures, and there's that the mother's friend at the end says something along the lines of, we've rectified the mistake, you had the inappropriate female body and now you've got the male body. And Charlie has a conversation earlier saying she likes spending time with her grandmother, but has the sense that she wanted her to be a boy. And so the idea that Charlie is in some way the promised coming of Paimon, and that actually perhaps is in the film is possessed or something at the earlier point, because there's the recurrence of the models that she makes on the table of the mother's friend. There's kind of shot of that. And it has the son's picture in the middle of the kind of triangle, and so there's these kind of, and the motif of the beheading the pigeon as well, and then you have Charlie's head on the Paimon statue, and then I looked up because Paimon is from the Lesser Key of Solomon, which is a kind of esoteric book in the Western mystery tradition, and rather than necessarily being like Pazuzu in The Exorcist, who is I think a Babylonian or a Mesopotamian demon, this is being from a work of kind of Renaissance occult magic, that this is just an invented demon. It's not taken from an earlier religion and an old god mutated into a demon. This is kind of created as a demon in a book about conjuring demons. But apparently is often depicted with, whilst kind of being male and described as male, is depicted as having a female face. So there's something, if you know that, there's something quite pleasing. But like, I recognised the name, and I kind of knew where to go to. It's like, I'll go to the big book of demons and find out if I'm right. But I don't know if knowing that makes the film better or makes it make more sense, but it's fun, I guess, in a way. But
I think in a way this sort of speaks to what I was saying about there being kind of a feeling of there being a code in the film that you need to kind of crack to really understand it. So the idea that basically I hadn't heard of Pyre, and I didn't know anything that you just brought up, and obviously there is then a kind of interesting and fun, as you say, link there. But the idea that like I would have to sort of need to know that to make more sense of it, or that the film can't expect you to know that, obviously. So is it there as a kind of Easter egg, or is it kind of there's like something really meaningful that just means that most people aren't going to get the full kind of understanding of what the filmmaker wants you to get out of it, you know, like there was something about like the symbol. There's a symbol that keeps cropping up in the film. I think it's on the lamppost that Charlie that kills Charlie, and I think it shows up in the models as well.
It's on one of the embroidered welcome mats. It's on the book, and it's the necklace as well. Yeah, and
this symbol keeps coming up, and it felt. I remember something similar in Kill List. Well, there's one since I've seen Kill List, so correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a similar kind of symbol that just pitches up from time to time, and it's never really made into anything. No one kind of fixates on it and says, now this symbol, and let's do something with it. It just kind of shows up as if to say, like, behind everything there's a plan. But that feels really dissatisfactory to me. It feels like it's all very well as a filmmaker just to put this symbol around the place, but if it's not really pointing at anything more concrete, if there's nothing that within the film is kind of built out of it, feels kind of lame to me. But then maybe I'm missing something.
Do you find it equally unsatisfying in both Kill List and Hereditary?
I think I do. Although, as I said, I think it's a while since I've seen Kill List, so I don't remember it all that well. But it just seems like... I mean, actually in Kill List, I didn't even notice it all that much the first time. But someone pointed out to me, did they see the symbol? The symbol's there all the time. And then someone was looking out for it the next time. And then I kind of went, okay, so it's there, but...
I didn't mind that in this film. Because actually, I just think that it's kind of used as a narrative device. It's a way of you being able to kind of then make links and, in a way, guiding you through this unsolving of a mystery. Really, that you begin to connect what's happening in the house to, you know, the grandmother and the grandmother's best friend. Yeah,
is it Joni, the friend? Joan. Yeah.
So, you know, you begin to kind of, you know, make all of those connections and then see that there is a plan for everything. So actually uses that kind of narrative link device. I think that works quite well. I didn't mind that.
And I think there's something pleasing in the way that by doing that, it evokes how the occult and the esoteric works, in that it is meaningless unless you know the code. So, and it almost puts you in the position of a horror film protagonist. If you start seeing the code... And if you think of those kind of the numerology films like The Number 23 or Knowing, even, where you start seeing meaning everywhere that you haven't seen before. But I don't think the characters react to it enough.
Yes.
I think that's the thing. We're there as the audience, we are put in that paranoid state of seeing meaning whenever this symbol reoccurs. We're privy to the words written on the wallpaper at various points throughout the house, and I think we see Toni Collette replicating one of them, which I think is a really interesting moment in terms of, is there magic involved in her? Is there something ritualistic about the replicating the house in every detail and the control and that kind of thing? And is it dangerous to just naively copy words? I mean, because one of the things I particularly like about The Exorcist is the way that it kind of uses sacramental language to convey power, that there is some kind of struggle and that words are meaningful. And you kind of get this through the words being written and hidden. I think I'm talking myself into thinking I liked the film more than I actually did, but I think maybe that's part of what you're getting at, is that if you're actually interested in and enjoy this kind of, I'm going to unpack how this film is engaging with the occult, not just in a kind of content way, but formally, how is this an esoteric film? How is it an occult film? That's really interesting. You know, I immediately went away and went, okay, I've got enough clues to try and make sense of how much of this is made up for the film and how much of this is kind of, for want of a better word, real ritual magic. But again, like, that doesn't... You know, going back to The Exorcist, I guess, because I know it's one that you're not particularly fond of, Jose, but I think it's really good as a template for the religious or the ritual or the occult film. The choice of Pazuzu as the demon in that is interesting. I mean, one, the icon looks scary and has superficial resemblances to depictions of Lucifer, so there's that. But there's also the fact that it's actually used as a protection against another type of demon that particularly preys on children and pregnant mothers. So there's this kind of both the link to Catholicism in the film, but also this link to demonology and older traditions. Whereas I don't know why choosing Paimon works so much in that way, other than it being this kind of perhaps a lesser known but actual demon.
Do you think it's fair for me to have sort of said that that the film should have explained more, or that it was being kind of ambiguous, whereas actually bringing a knowledge of the kind of things you're talking about to the film would have opened it up for me? Like, it's kind of, is it more my fault than the films that I didn't really get on with it?
But I'm not sure those things actually point anywhere. I think that there's the pleasure of reference hunting, but I'm just not sure, like, the words that are scribbled on the walls have a look about them that made me think of various languages used in ritual magic. I didn't know what they were. I mean, it's not... I mean, I guess you can't write abracadabra because that's been devalued into being just a word for stage magic. But, like, it's not the kind of... They had the look of words of power or names of demons, but they're not necessarily from any single tradition, or they're not... So there's not this rigorous...
and they're not made coherent within the context of the film. Like, they're shown and then they go away.
Let me... one of the things that I found that was really surprising and interesting about the film was that there were moments that I found, like, deeply affecting. So as a kind of a family melodrama, almost, you know, there are moments where you find yourself moved, right? But they feel very inconsistent. And then when you try to relate that aspect of the film as a kind of family melodrama to some larger theme, like, what is it saying about the family, or what is it saying about the family in America, or I couldn't quite, you know, extrapolate. I couldn't quite. It didn't seem cohesive enough to then kind of use that as, you know, a springboard to something else. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
I think that is a limit. I think that goes hand in hand with the... Yes, it's doing all this occult stuff, but that's not necessarily gelling with what it's saying about the family or anything like that. Whereas I think arguably something like The Shining or the Amityville Horror or Insidious or the recent Conjuring films, these kind of... I mean, several of those are just, you know, they're just straightforward horror films. They're not talked about in terms of post-horror or art horror, other than The Shining, perhaps, are saying things about the family. They're saying things about precarity and kind of, you know, a lot of these films are this house is suspiciously cheap. That's fine. We'll live here, you know. And the reason it's suspiciously cheap is because it's a murder house or something like that. You know, I think something like Drag Me to Hell is saying something really interesting about the financial crisis and kind of how even a normal person is implicated, even someone who sees themselves as innocent might be implicated in that kind of system.
Yes.
Whereas other than a statement, other than those moments where you have someone reacting to something just unprocessable, like real sort of moments of horror that can't be contained in any way, I'm not sure what how the horror is adding to the allegory that just doing a family melodrama about a terrible accident wouldn't say, which I think is a shame. And in a way making it fated, having it kind of so the telegraph pole, the lamppost or whatever it is, having the symbol on it, all leading towards the point, almost devalues this idea of we're dealing with a horrible accident that no one can deal with. If it had done a sort of Pet Sematary kind of deal where it's I can't deal with, you know, the death of a child is a terrible thing, even though you know they won't come back right, will you still go through with this ritual? Will you still make a deal with the devil to fix this? And then the recognition that it is unfixable and that you've kind of just by perverting the natural course of things, something terrible has happened. Whereas that's not the case here. It's preying on her desire to speak with her daughter again, but it's not. It hasn't got that sense of you've transgressed in some. He keeps having these hints of the mother's transgressions. This, you know, oh, you don't have the appropriate love for one of your children. Although, kind of in Interstellar, that's apparently that's fine. But I digress. But you know, there's none of these moments where it's a character's. It talks about blame all the time, and yet the idea is it was a witch cult all along.
Yeah.
Kind of undermines that, I think, and I think it's the horror working against the real sadness and horror that's coming out of the family melodrama.
Right. What you want to see is the horror being used to build upon and emphasise and basically respond to the way that characters behave and the decisions that they make. It should be some sort of reaction or punishment or something like that for that. But as you say, it's just behind it all, it was a conspiracy by the Druids.
Yeah. But like, because even in a more conventional haunting film, even if it had just been Charlie coming back and haunting the son, that actually being a manifestation of either his guilt or the mother blaming him, and that being the thing that needs to be exorcised, that's a much more straightforward, old-fashioned horror plot.
Yeah.
But that connects the two halves of the film, and I think it's unfortunate that there is that kind of... There's a sense that there is the occult impinging on this normal world. It's been there as this secretive framework all the time, manipulating everyone, which is interesting in its own right, but when that starts undermining the things that are so successful about the film.
When I think back on it, I think I'd like to see the version of the film where it's allowed to continue being a pretty regular drama about people having tragedy and arguments and trying to process his grief. Because I think, like you say, the idea, the depiction of people kind of processing grief or unusual kind of shocking things as being just to shut down, that is fantastic, and that's something that felt really original. And then it's almost as though the film doesn't have the confidence to it's like, oh my god, I've got something really good here, but I don't know how I'm going to live up to it. I'll just throw in some sort of seances.
I want to just ask you, because one of the things that I felt when watching the film was that it had that it was pulling in two directions. So on the one hand, Toni Collette, who is really fabulous in the film, was sometimes voicing things that you could see as feminist or kind of things that women might feel but are silenced from saying, like not wanting a child or not liking their children, or having tried to abort them, or wanting to set them on fire, right? Like kind of, you can imagine an exasperated, depressed mother maybe thinking all of those things but not being able to say. So the film voices it. So, on the one hand, it has elements that might be seen as kind of feminist elements. And on the other hand, I felt it was quite misogynistic in ways that I couldn't quite make a good argument about, but that I nonetheless felt. And I wonder, what your feelings were on this.
Yeah, and I think it's because it's almost a clash of two traditions of representation of women in the horror film. And one is that is actually something you get in Insidious as well, is the representation of the father or the male figure in the film as completely rational, that is the skeptic and needs to be convinced by facts, which I think we get in this with Gabriel Byrne, and the mother reading everything as supernatural, but that being coded as hysteria, that and the kind of the policing of that, and Rosemary's Baby does that really well with her paranoia, and that she's right. There's that presentation of kind of female madness, which can either be left ambiguous or can be a vindication of, everyone has said that this is a wrong way of thinking, they've been policing my emotions, and they've said I've been irrational, but this was actually the correct way to process this situation. And I'm not sure that Hereditary ever goes, this is the correct way to process this situation, and I think you end up having a lot more sympathy for Gabriel Byrne's character to an extent, even though it comes to the point right when he says, this isn't helping you, I'm not going to do it anymore, that being the turning point of, well, actually, maybe if I did behave the way you were behaving, it would be the correct way to solve this. But that's butting up, that kind of tradition is butting up against the evil old witch. It's the grandmother and her friend that are the leader of this witch cult, that have been manipulating everything from behind the scenes, that have an obsession with the young male body. There's this whole thing happening there, and that they are the big bad, and that they've been manipulating everything all along. So on the one hand, you've got this, what could be a really interesting exploration of how the behaviour of a woman is managed and controlled, and especially around things like childbirth and grief and that sort of stuff. And then it's the cackling coven of witches that want to bring about, that want wealth and to resurrect this kind of perfect male, then in service to a male demon as well.
And what about the repeated imagery of decapitated women?
Yes.
See that a lot.
Yes.
And there's a little bit of, I think there's a little bit of luxury in it, insofar as, well, luxury is probably overdoing it, but the film the film enjoys sort of, you're going to be shocked by seeing this little girl's decapitated head covered in ants getting eaten. It's just that it is horrific and it is shocking, and I suppose it's a kind of, if that's what you want, it's a great image, but it feels like it kind of lives for showing this a little bit too much.
And also I didn't like the way that Toni Collette was done away with. It felt really brutal. And actually, I think there could have been a film in which she wins, and actually that would have transformed everything, right? And kind of and turned it into a more of a pro-women or feminist kind of statement. Whereas actually, the film does luxuriate in punishing her. And like in a way that feels unpleasant. It's not just a glorious set piece where you can have fun with it, because actually that is the protagonist. So I kind of there were all these elements that kind of, in not working, seem really questionable.
I mean, she also kind of gets total, even before the moment of decapitation, she's become inhuman. By that point as well, she's scuttling around walls, she's hovering. There's all these kind of, so you lose that sense of it being a human struggle anymore. She just becomes, like you're saying, it's got all these different elements. That's when it becomes the monster movie, which is exciting. I love the sound. The use of sound in that scene is great, but I was kind of hoping it would be more like the grandmother's corpse was making that sound as it tried to animate itself. Rather, it's a like the decapitation. It's striking imagery, but and I don't know if they're trying to build a kind of vocabulary there with, I don't know, just with what I then went away and found out about. Well, okay, so our women's are women's heads important ritual components of this, or is that just?
And I suppose if they are in the sort of lore of Paimon, if it is important, as you say, she has Paimon has a girl's face, and that women's heads can be sort of construed as important in the film in that way, the film doesn't do anything to actually convince you of that or show you that. It's just a repeated image of a female body with no head, or a female head with no body, that appears to be really meaningless within the context of the film specifically.
Yeah, well, because we get the underlined bit of text saying he's covetous of a male body, and then we get the big image of it'll give you riches. But that, and there's the suggestion that maybe this ritual has been tried before, because is it the father starved himself to death and the son hanged himself? So again, it's particularly male mental illness that's being listed back, and it's playing with that whole idea of supernatural events being read as mental illness and madness because they're completely contrary to the rational world and the way that things work.
So let me just change the conversation a little bit. So seeing as we've gone through so many different ways in which the film is unsatisfactory, why do you think it's been such a big hit?
I think the fact that we're having this conversation is perhaps part of it. Like, it's definitely a film that begs conversation, and I think I've had more fun talking about it than I did watching it.
I always find this with movies that I didn't really like very much. I find that doing the podcast makes me more interested. It makes me like the film more as well.
Yes.
You know.
So I think it speaks to a really important aspect of film going, which is talking to someone about the film afterwards. I also think it's
that's the name of this podcast.
yes. But I think it's just part of the course of, like, suddenly horror films people are watching horror films and allowing them to be good. I don't know.
That's been going on for many years now, right? So that's not precisely to do with this film, and yet I do find the success of it kind of interesting, because it's a low budget film. It as we discussed in the last podcast, it's already made something like, it cost 10 million. It's already made 45 million. It's only been in release for a little while. People are wanting to discuss it. They're attracted to it. So what is it about this? What is it about the film that is connecting with audiences? I think that's
well, it's interesting because on the one hand, it's made a good profit. On the other, I think there's been a real mismatch between critical reception and audience reception. Audiences, although they've gone to see it, have come out not having had a good time.
A
lot. I mean,
I don't know. People walked out of our screening.
A few people did walk out. I don't know how much you can sort of. I know that people have played with Rotten Tomatoes and things to try and give certain films bad scores. Star Wars, so it's stupid. I don't really think that's going to be the case with a film like Hereditary, but you can see a very stark difference between critics who like it a great deal and audiences who found it slow and boring. The kind of typical difference that you find in arty cinema. Right. Critics that like it and audiences that don't. So audiences have gone to see it, but I don't know if they've gone to see it twice. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's an interesting
And I think aesthetically, there's a lot about it that speaks to particular qualities that are valued in art cinema and independent cinema, like its slowness, the use of long shots, that it's this very distant. There is something Kubrickian about it and like The Shining, in that rather than having a mid shot, you're having a long shot, so you're further away from events, you're further away from the characters, that you're showing empty spaces before a character enters them, rather than being in a more kind of traditional intensified continuity type style that you would see in horror films. And I think that this is perhaps me being overly defensive as a horror fanboy, but I think that appeals to critics who would not normally think twice about a horror film. What I'd be interested to see was what horror fan publications are saying about the film, which I haven't looked into yet because I've tried to see it as fresh as possible. But I think it's a compelling film. It's really interesting to talk about, but I also think that there have been equally interesting and more enjoyable conventional horror films. But then I even think something like The Witch or Get Out are more enjoyable horror films.
Yes, they are.
And they work better as horror films than this
Also,
does.
Just to go back to your idea of the Kubrickian, you know, I think so, because that's one of the things that Mike brought out in the last podcast. You know, the wonderful use of long shots and long takes and so on. But on the other hand, there's a disjuncture between that and what I feel is like a really ugly mise en scène. You know, that kind of very little attention has been paid to color, right, and framing and composition, and you know, of making things meaningful, you know, and beautiful. Yeah, that it's a, you know, as an aesthetic experience, that it's all that gray. Right, so...
And I think it's a misunderstanding of the Kubrick style as only being about the framing and not about what's in the frame.
Exactly.
That's Tom Hooper.
I mean, look at Barry Lyndon, you know.
And I think there's something, you know, that you're missing the richness of which is weird considering it's got, you know, rather than letting you see that there are these weird bits of writing on the wall in one of its many big long shots, it just shows you a disconnected close-up of the writing on the wall. So why not have these? I mean, if you watched Room 237, there's a lot of weird occult esoteric readings of things like tins of coffee or tins of peaches or something.
Yes, I love
like that. And you know, and I think that kind, it's like the film is trying to motivate that kind of reading, but can only do it by going, look at this line I've underlined in the book, here's a really pointed close-up of that symbol that you've seen in other places, rather than it being there. Whereas I think more like with Kill List, it's kind of just there.
Yeah.
And you only see it once you're able to see it. And so I think there's, like you were saying, there's that lack of use of colour and richness of imagery that you get with even, you know, something like The Shining being the closest comparison, and it's just kind of a grey, normal suburban house.
It strikes me that films that handle films that are about the occult and kind of folk horror, although I'm not very well versed in them, that it seems to me they have to start off without that. They have to start off in a kind of unmolested real world and then introduce these elements. Which is probably why I don't get on with these films so much, because as they do more and more of that, I'm going, but you're losing what I really enjoyed. So I'm not that interested in the occult. I don't find it saying that it's not saying that I have a pre-existing interest in. It's not saying that I'm interested in kind of finding the clues or background out about particularly. So these films kind of start off building these real stories, real dramas, quote unquote, and then introduce these weirder aspects that kind of turn me off, which is exactly what happened with this, which is exactly what happened with Kill List. And are there examples of films that just start off within the occult world, kind of straight up, and say this is what this film's going to be?
I think it seems to work better with period pieces. So The Witch being a more recent example, you're dealing with a milieu in which people believe in witchcraft.
Yeah.
So, and the archaic language and the discussions about, you know, they leave the village because he's dissenting from a dissenting religious sect. So that idea of religion and the supernatural is already built into it. Or Blood on Satan's Claw, which is really wonderful. Kind of, it opens with like I believe it's like a shot of a raven in a bare branched tree, and then a ploughman ploughs up a kind of skull, and you see all of these wonderful shots from within the furrows, and so this idea of the evil coming out of the land. Or you have something like The Wicker Man, where you have an outsider coming into a place where the occult is rife, you know, and they are quite openly and happily pagan, and that's not something that Sergeant Howie can deal with, because that's one of the things about folk horror, is the idea of an outsider coming into a community with different ways, kind of an older way of doing things. And you see that a lot on the kind of the TV versions of folk horror, like something like Children of the Stones. You have a scientist and his son coming to a village which is shot in Avebury, so it's all within a stone circle, and it's a cult. And they become, and they come. So I think you either have that sense of there is this, or even Kill List kind of works in that kind of way of outsiders coming into a place. Or to stick with Ben Wheatley, you have A Field in England, which is set in a period where that kind of thing is more straightforwardly believable. So there has to be...
I suppose also the audiences, like these films are made for audiences. These films are not made for tiny communities of 400 people that dance around stone circles.
Yes.
These films are made for people, these films are made for people that by and large don't believe in this stuff anyway, or if they even do, they don't believe in this particular sort of aspects that the film might be talking about. So you have to sort of start it off for everybody before drawing these things out, I suppose. Do you think what the reason that I wanted to talk to you was because I remember you being interested in not just horror but particularly kind of British and occult style horror. I think was your dissertation on that?
I did my MA on Hammer. So.
Right. Yeah. So is it? Do you think is it fair of me to have sort of made that link? I suppose just to sort of say, oh, this is a bit occulty. I'll see if Matt wants to talk about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely fair. But yeah, and I think to identify it as that kind of film is accurate in that it's not making up a supernatural in the way that Insidious is for or Poltergeist is, for example. It's going, let's look at some Renaissance medieval horror texts and but not horror texts, demonography and use that. And I think that's something that you definitely get with some folk horror is completely made up, but I think increasingly there's that interest in tying it to some sort of cult belief already existing. And just the idea of, shall we talk to Matt about that? I completely agree with, because I am particularly interested in that kind of horror, I think.
I have a couple more questions then. Do you think that tying it to something that has a historical basis as opposed to making something up, do you think that what do you think the reasons for people doing that are? Do you think it kind of makes it more horrific, maybe? Or...
Well, I mean, I think you can go right back to what's happening with the Gothic and right back to Castle of Otranto, where you have kind of the claims that this is a translated, authentic medieval text. So in some respects, it's always been happening with horror. Or the claims to this is a true story that you get with Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Well, that sounds more like found footage type of stuff.
Yeah.
Like Blair Witch, like this actually happened and people recorded it on their own video camera and we've just found it and we're showing it to you.
And I think I personally see Blair Witch as an excellent example of folk horror because of the way that it uses both presenting itself as a kind of urban legend and the way that folklore is woven through the film as well, even though it's a manufactured folklore. But I don't know, because one of the things, again, that I really like about The Exorcist is that I feel that it's grounded in something, possibly just because it's grounded in something that I'm familiar with, so that kind of the language of Catholic ritual is something I know. So for me, that's still going to be the most effective encounter with the occult on film, I think, just because in those moments there's a rhythm to the speech, the types of words being used that feel real to me, and that as a child was my encounter with the supernatural in a way that talking about the never in Insidious, which I otherwise love, just doesn't. That's just made up for a film. That's not real. So I wonder if but then I don't. How many people are familiar with Paimon? So there's a lot more Catholics than there are Mesopotamians. It's
exactly maybe one of the reasons. I mean, I know that you've said the other day. You said it's only Mark Kermode that has made this the huge thing that it is, and I think that's at least partially true. But the idea that people are more familiar with the framework of Catholicism going into The Exorcist. Makes it more kind of relatable to a wider audience than
absolutely
something like this. The one last thing I wanted to say was although I maybe didn't say this, but I kind of associate occult and folk horror with Britain. But you've given lots of examples of American Hollywood films that also deal with the same thing, and obviously Hereditary as well. So do you think that's fair to associate that with Britain? Is it a particularly British type of horror, or is it actually more wide, or is it something that we do more than we do other types of horror?
I mean, as far as I'm familiar with the history of the term, it certainly came to popularity in Mark Gatiss's A History of horror, which was focused on Britain, and he had one episode on Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man, which have become the unholy trinity of folk horror, and a kind of like partly tongue-in-cheek referred to as that within the scholarship on folk horror. And so because of that, I think it's been particularly associated with British film and British television as well. Like I mentioned, a few of the kind of like 70s kids shows have a lot of folk horror in them, which is interesting. And with writers like M.R. James and Nigel Neal. And I think the whole idea of small communities dancing around stone circles, that idea that you can have an otherwise isolated, quite backwards community, there seems to be the use of landscapes, there seems to be something particularly British about that. But I don't actually think it's the norm for British horror. If you compare that to, I mean, Hammer have really only made original Hammer, have made 2 films that might be considered folk horror. One is The Witches, which has Joan Fontaine, I think I've remembered that right, coming into a community that has a cult, and The Devil Rides Out, which has Christopher Lee as the good guy, which is fun. But otherwise, you've got Hammer and Amicus, which aren't really interested in folklore. Hammer are very much interested in monsters. In big Gothic houses, because that was where they shot films. But in terms of perhaps the use of landscape that's associated with those films, I think there's something that chimes with other depictions of the British countryside.
Right.
There.
I suppose it occurred to me that we still have stone circles and hedges and things dating back from early sort of communities of people, long before kind of organised religion started happening. You can still see them, you can visit them. I mean, they're all over the bloody place, you can fall over.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, because the modern civilization of America is so new, it only started 250 years ago, so before that it would be the Native Americans. And I suppose you get that trope of building things on an Indian burial ground, but it doesn't, that element of like the local history doesn't seem as important in American horror as it does here. Or I suppose it could be.
I don't know if that's just true. You and I.
Think of Poltergeist.
Yeah. Well, but I was also wondering if that's just you and I being better at seeing the local in a British film than in a North American.
Yes,
or
I would think that's true.
Yeah.
So Matt, kind of, how would you? Final thoughts on Hereditary, but also, how would you relate Hereditary to, the spate of horror films that have come out in the last 5 or 6 years? Where do you see it fitting in? Maybe even the last decade, actually, because I think maybe a decade is more, because the film that you mentioned, which was the one about the young girl who's selling mortgages.
Drag Me to Hell.
Drag Me to Hell. For me, that seemed to be like a kind of shift.
I think something that we've interestingly seen in horror of the last decade is looking at the 70s with nostalgia as a period of when horror films were good. When, in criticism of the time, it was like, oh, these aren't as good as the films from the 30s, the slasher and...
But there's Halloween, Poltergeist, the Omen films. Like, there is quite a lot that seemed marginal at the time, but that actually became
and they've
really
become a
huge
canon
hits.
now, I think, as well. And there's that sense of looking back, and there's a lot of focus on kind of just that as a period of interest, either with the films being shot then, or with a lot of films interested in obsolete media, like kind of analog photography and film and filmmaking, as
Insidious, right?
And
type stuff.
that kind of thing. And I mean, before that, the main threads in horror were torture porn and the found footage film, which I think we're seeing less of now, and a return to these family goes to a suspiciously cheap house and a haunting happens a lot more. And I wonder if that's part of where the conversation about quality is coming in as well, because found footage will always look cheap. That's the point. Yeah. And people don't like gore. So a return to hauntings, to family focused, to focuses on the economic realities of the period and how that might play out through these family focused horrors, I think are interesting.
I think that's interesting because then that's also a way of tying them into like, you know, contemporary culture. So, you know, the precarity, the economic uncertainty, the, you know, the drops in the housing market and people losing their homes and that being tied to, you know, a rise in superstition. Yes. You know, the way that kind of our culture now, you know, fake news, that kind of facts become put into question, and so on. So kind of that is an interesting kind of social context for a film like Hereditary, I think. Any last thoughts on the film itself?
I guess just want to call back to what Mike was saying about the idea that it is a film that talking about is very, very interesting and unpicking it, and maybe that is almost what the film is for. It's poised to have that discussion afterwards. That's why there are those loosenesses and ambiguities that you then get together and have that paranoid discussion of, you know, the fact that it prompts that way of thinking, that paranoia, I think is really, that paranoid analysis is really, really interesting, and that's something that I didn't appreciate watching the film on my own. So now I think
sounds like we kind of share our reservations though about it not really adding up and kind of throwing more things out than it's willing to make coherent.
Yeah, or even just at the conclusions that I end up drawing, I'm not entirely satisfied with. That when I do attempt to tie it up, where it's pointing isn't ultimately as interesting as the questions it's asking.
Well, I think that's that's a wonderful place to end at. You know, this underlining that in spite of the film's being unsatisfactory in many ways, that it certainly offered us a great deal of pleasure in talking about it, and particularly in talking about it with you, Matt.
Well, the thing is, it's a great film to talk about if you can find yourself a horror guru.
Yes. Right. Well, thank you very much, horror guru Matt Denny.
Eavesdropping at the Movies is on SoundCloud and Facebook and Twitter and all that. You, Matt, are on Twitter.
I am on Twitter.
What's your handle?
At Matt_Denny. It's nice and straightforward.
Nice and simple. And we're at Eavesdrop Movies, no underscore.
Yes.
Yeah. We'll have to come back when we see another horror movie.
Right. So thank you. Thank you, Matt, and thank you very much for listening.
Bye-bye.